Hello, good morning. Welcome along to this session on sports washing. And we've got Joey Durso from The Athletic and Miguel Delaney from The Independent. And sports washing is one of those topics that can often lead to some fiery discussion and debate on social media in particular, as some fans might not take too kindly to what we say. First of all, because it's such a fraught issue, how do you understand the term sports washing to mean?
Well, first of all, I think it's always put in the terms of what I would say is a misunderstanding. People think it's about simple public relations in terms of Saudi Arabia by Newcastle, they want good press, that's it. That's not it at all. I think that's a very, very, very minor part of it. I think it's much more sophisticated than that, and it's probably been done in the most sophisticated manner by Abu Dhabi and Manchester City, given that you actually see there's so fewer questions about it than there are at Newcastle. But it's essentially about, I suppose, and having spoken to a lot of human rights bodies, activists and experts on this, it's about states that would otherwise have hugely questionable records trying to integrate themselves into the structure of the West to continue to do business and create alternative economies basic for a post-oil world. As well as, I mean, on quite blunt terms, as Adam Kugel of Human Rights Watch put it to me, it's about making them being seen, these are good guys to do business with. So almost public relations is almost kind of a secondary or tertiary part of it. And even that, I mean, people often go on about how, they own these clubs, and it actually brings so many more negative headlines. You get Amnesty talking about human rights, or journalists talking about it. But that becomes completely diluted. It's a small part of a much larger whole, where suddenly they're being talked about just as owner of these clubs. And even, I mean, if we're talking about integration into Western infrastructure, look what's happened with Abu Dhabi and Manchester, where they've constructed an entire building empire. Where they own so much of Manchester, all sorts of gleaming buildings there, out of purchasing the club. So yeah, I would say it's a multifaceted thing. And certainly the PR that people think, or the washing aspect, is actually quite minor.
And we do see that actually things like property deals are a way into the city by getting, say, the football club. But Joey, you worked at Westminster before moving into sports investigations. The thing often said is, well, why should football have this high morality code? You've got the government doing deals with Saudi Arabia, you've got the UAE heavily involved economically with Britain. I think the last head of state the Queen met was actually the Emir of Qatar. So how do you look at it from that perspective? The fact governments have these close dealings already with these countries that sport is asking to reject.
Well, I think the first thing to say is that two things can be bad at once. And I think often when you talk about things in football, people will say, you're a hypocrite because I found this tweet from you 6 years ago which says this, so let's not, so your criticism is invalid immediately. And, it's possible for two things to be bad at once. We can criticize Britain or America's dealings in the Middle East and football. I think also, I think politicians should meet other head states, other leaders that we potentially find many of their views abhorrent, or I think that's an essential part of the government's job. I don't think you can kind of no platform the Emir of Qatar or whatever, even if we might disagree with him. So I think these two things are very different. On Miguel's point about the PR, the sports washing, I spent a week in Qatar in July, and I think it's a really open question whether Qatar's reputation standing in the West is going up or down because of this. I think people working on the committee organising the World Cup, or Qataris, basically think, why are we getting all this? Look at Dubai across the Gulf, and their human rights are worse, they argue, and they're not getting all this flack.
Well, I think that's an interesting part of it in itself, because I would actually argue that, I mean, sports washing isn't a new thing. You can basically go back to Roman bread and circuses as the kind of the initial sports washing. And among the most famous sports washing event in history, although the term was unknown then, was the 1936 Olympics. But it's also why I think actually hosting tournaments, and it's interesting the timeline of this too, but hosting tournaments is basically becoming, it's an outdated form of sports washing. And it's arguably true that it hasn't had the impact intended, it hasn't been the positive intended, because it brought this flurry of bad press. At the same time, as someone in one of the human rights organizations put to me, well, basically, I mean, it's probably been a resounding success, because, put bluntly, Qatar is a lot harder to invade or bomb if they're hosting a World Cup, or they've just hosted a World Cup. But certainly, I do think it isn't anywhere near as powerful as owning a football club, which I think is a much more insidious and successful way to sports wash. And that's why the timeline there is crucial, I suppose, because Qatar initially tried to buy Manchester United Roma, failed, and this was after Abu Dhabi bought Manchester City. I mean, all of this is tied up in the rivalry around the Gulf blockade. Didn't get Manchester United Roma, went for the World Cup, got it, to everyone's surprise, and then, of course, from that, actually managed to buy a club in Paris Saint-Germain. And I think Paris Saint-Germain has actually been a much more successful sports washing enterprise for them.
And how, as journalists, should this be approached? It's one of those challenges where we have the sporting success, we have the stars, PSG, Neymar, Messi to write about and to discuss. Should the sports washing aspect come into every aspect of the match reporting or the general sort of discussion of the club?
Sure, and I think you can do both. I think you can report on an exciting match and then say, this is going down the road, these are the conditions that the stadiums were built. It kind of goes into this thing of like hypocrisy, or you must be, everything you say must fit into this completely cohesive worldview, and you can do two things at once. You can talk about the sport and you can talk about the circumstances around it.
But even the hypocrisy point that you get so much if you comment on this, where everyone always points out some issue that runs against what you're saying. Well, that is part of the point of it as well. One of the reasons they're investing in so much into infrastructure is basically because it's impossible for anyone to entangle them. So one of the classic ones that came up with Newcastle, the classic response was, well, how can you criticize this when you use Uber or you use Twitter, given Saudi investment? But this is part of the point. It's about that integration. But just in relation to the coverage, I would argue it's increasingly important to place it in a wider context, I say. Because this is a challenge for journalists in that way as well, and something we've thought about a lot. Whereas if you just, and it applies to the World Cup as well, and it's been something we've been wrestling with before going. If you just write about this in purely sporting terms, are you also complicit in the sports washing? Because you're essentially talking about it in a very benign way without mentioning what the intention of this is, what the source of it is, or what the source of the ownership is. Which is why I think there's a great, and it's interesting, there's been a shift there as well, because I think basically for almost a decade really, the Abu Dhabi ownership of Manchester City really kind of went, no one really talked about it.
Was that in part because actually the human rights groups weren't onto us as media talking about it? When the takeover happened in 2008, you didn't have Amnesty highlighting issues. They weren't even really significantly onto media ahead of the World Cup vote in 2010 for Qatar.
Yeah, there was an element to that, and I think also because it felt a bit more, when the takeover happened, it was a much more unprepared world. I think probably people didn't really conceive that this was possible, that a state would look to buy a club. I mean, when you stand back now, it's actually inevitable almost how it's gone in football, given the commercial power of football, given more importantly the social power. I mean, there is an argument that football is a stronger cultural force than anything we've seen in history. And that might sound like an exaggeration, but if you think about it, Leo Messi and Cristiano Ronaldo are probably known in more countries worldwide now than Elvis Presley ever was at his peak, just because they've got that penetration. And if you're a state looking to, I suppose, use the power of that's an immensely effective tool. And so some of it is football's own problem, because it comes out of the size the game has grown to financially, the lack of regulation, the inability to kind of foresee any of these things. And now suddenly it seems obvious that they've done it. And I think it was belatedly that the people realized what was actually happening. Especially we look at the documentation from Abu Dhabi about their plans for diversification. Even there's been so much reporting about when they bought the club in 2008. It was literally said in a meeting by Gary Cook. He's spoken about this on the record. They talked about buying City as a proxy brand for your nation. And I think it's only been through the work of people like Nick McGeehan of previously Human Rights Watch, now Fair Square, that a greater awareness of this started to spread. But also actually a key development was Football Leaks in 2018, because that started to spell out a lot of what was the intensity of connection.
There is the sense also, you hear this say from around Qatar, that this pressure from media, the criticism of sports washing, leads to change in these countries. But are we seeing that, say, in Saudi Arabia? This is the year of golf sports washing, you could say, with Live Golf.
Well, I think it has led to changes in Qatar, and I think it's important to recognise that being largely a result of criticism. I think labour laws in Qatar have improved since the announcement of the World Cup.
Well, laws have changed. Implementation hasn't.
I completely agree. Yeah. But as in, like, I don't think that's happening in Saudi Arabia. I think the fact that everyone will be going to Qatar, and as you say, like these, what are they called? The work where you have to pay to get a. Yeah. Like a lot of this stuff hasn't changed, but I think you have to recognise, like, the only way that things work is from criticism and from sustained criticism. And when people kind of say, don't criticise me anymore, it's like, well, you have to force any change. And something I heard a lot in Qatar was, what about Russia? Russia's just invaded Ukraine. 2018, the World Cup's in Russia. Like, why wasn't everyone criticising that? And I think the answer is, well, they should have been. And some people were. But, I think more scrutiny, more criticism, more pressure, like, why be afraid of that?
Yeah, I mean, I must say, I think they're sensitive to criticism insofar as they want to push back against it. As regards to actually reading, I'd be dubious. I mean, if you look again, if you return to Abu Dhabi, every human rights group would say the human rights situation is worse in Abu Dhabi now than it was in 2008, especially as regards being locked up for dissent. With Qatar, again, it comes back to this issue. I mean, and this has been a classic, actually, in the build-up to the Qatar, where there's been a lot of big headlines about change. Then 18 months' time, people look at it and realize actually the implementation has been completely lacking, which again just feeds back to what you're saying, I suppose, about sensitivity to press.
And potentially co-opting organisations that help feed this message that everything has changed. It's extremely complex to try to work out. People say different things. And you can't just kind of turn up to these labour camps and start chatting to people.
Yeah. And as we look at Russia, people said, weren't they getting this focus at the time and saying, well, actually, it's better than we imagined. Well, what we could say at the time in 2018 is, yes, we've perhaps been welcomed by the locals. It doesn't actually change the country. And it's often sport talks about trying to change a country. We had it with some of the golfers on the Live Tour, hoping they could have an influence, but without saying what they wanted to change necessarily.
Well, it's something we heard a lot with the takeover of Newcastle United, that it could be a dialogue and Newcastle could help Saudi Arabia usher towards a liberal future. I mean, and then a few months later they executed 80 people. I mean, I think there's absolutely no sign of that happening, and it's almost the opposite. It's you get Newcastle fans on Twitter, and I understand that, in football terms they're doing brilliant at the moment. It's a club that have been neglected for years. I completely understand the excitement of being a Newcastle fan at the moment. But it's one thing to say, I don't want to talk about that.
Yeah.
It's another thing to say, which you see on Twitter, 80 people are killed, and you see Newcastle fans almost saying that wasn't real or that's been exaggerated, which blows my mind to see. But
they become so determined to defend their new ownership that they end up defending the country.
Rather than saying, I don't like it, it's a bit grubby, but I want to support my team, they almost start defending the Saudi regime, which is totally different.
Yeah. I mean, that's where actually I would initially have sympathy for fans in these situations, because ultimately,
they didn't choose it.
Yeah, they didn't choose it. Someone's bought their club. And I would actually argue, because so much is about the identity and how clubs are used, it's actually important for fans to go, almost to preserve what the club is actually about. Because, I mean, as Newcastle fans would say themselves, given Mike Ashley, the owner is never actually the club. But, as Joey says there, that shouldn't I think that's fine, but it shouldn't translate into pushback against anyone criticising what this is. And of course, that's a bigger question, because we could be getting into a future here, and it's something that's come up especially with what Haaland is doing in Manchester City now, Newcastle's evolution this season, which has already, I think, been quicker than anyone expected. They're already in the Champions League places. Whether they stay, we'll see, but clearly there's been improvements. But you can see which way the direction of travel is going. And it isn't hard to envisage a future where the top of the Premier League is basically Abu Dhabi's Manchester City fighting it out with Saudi Arabia's Newcastle United. I mean, is that what football is supposed to be for?
In the Champions League final against Qatar's PSG.
Yeah.
And that becomes about actually the value of the products as well. Do you diminish that competitive balance? But we're here as journalists. Often we're in that situation where you might have to ask, say, Eddie Howe at Newcastle, Pep Guardiola at Manchester City about wider issues. When do you choose the moment to actually ask? Should it be every single game? Should it be every press conference?
Rob is being very humble there. He actually chose a moment of City winning the League Cup final to ask.
But that was because Guardiola was wearing a yellow ribbon at the time.
Absolutely, that's exactly it. It was a totally legitimate question. Well, and there was the other one as well about the...
You and the golf.
Yeah, that was throwing it back in this direction. But it is one of those challenges. Also, the fans of the teams often question, why have you chosen this moment? But it is important to ask.
When do you ask? In fact, there's actually an argument that it's the moment of maximum success, when they're getting maximum sports washing value, because there's all this good feeling about what the ownership have been responsible for, which is success, that's actually when it needs to be counterbalanced with, well, hang on, this needs to be tempered with what the reality is, that they are using these clubs. They're using what are social institutions, huge community value, for basically pretty unpalatable political purposes.
As we sort of start to wrap up, where should sport draw the line? How should it decide where to host events, which investments it should take? Is that the difficult question?
Yeah, it's a very difficult question. I mean, I think in terms of, a lot of this discussion has been around criticism and when you should criticize. And I think criticism, as long as it's accurate, in fact, is just always a good thing, and there should be more of it. Scrutiny, criticism. And I think sometimes the debate comes under, you shouldn't be talking about that. Why now? Like, I think as long as we're fair and hear their side of the story and are accurate in our facts, I think the more the better.
Well, as a very basic one, given it's starting in 3 weeks, it's amazing it's starting in 3 weeks, because it's absolutely unconscionable that a World Cup is taking place that has involved any human suffering, let alone the number of deaths of migrant workers in Qatar, which we can't actually put a figure on because they won't investigate, which says enough in itself. I mean, so that should be a non-starter, really. To host a tournament, there should be human rights provisions. As regards ownership, then, well, I mean, for me, it should be pretty basic. These states should not be allowed to own football clubs. I mean, personally, I'd go much further back and insist on some sort of German or Spanish socio model, because once you get into fan-owned clubs, then it actually becomes impossible for these sort of interests. And it doesn't even need to be sports washing interests. It can be in terms of return on investment or any sort of capitalist ideals in club, where you start to kind of mitigate against that. And personally, I mean, that's where I draw the line. Much stronger football regulation.
And often you get some, like Qatar, perhaps that might look at inwards release at the UK and start to question, well, you're not perfect. And they might look at things like the treatment of migrants at the moment in the country.
Yeah.
And
I mean, if the UK state owned a football club in a foreign country to boost the UK's reputation, I'd find that pretty suspect. I'd happily criticise that if it were ever to happen.
So how bad is it going to get, do you think, as you would see it in the next sort of 50, 100 years? Is it going to be sort of completely state-dominated at the top of sports? Where we've seen golf, is there another sport that they're going to
I think, as Miguel said, I think Newcastle United are progressing quicker than anyone thought. I think in the very near future, the Premier League is going to be fought out between two Middle East oil clubs.
Yeah, I would agree. As to whether it's going to be, I mean, this is another problem for football in that sense that Jurgen Klopp alluded to a few weeks ago. I mean, really, whatever about financial fair play regulations, in the long term, they can be overcome by just the scale of the ownership and the investment, because over the long term, it matters less. Which essentially means you need, at the moment, a revenue of 300 to 400 million to compete, which means basically a state takeover. There's not many states going around, and it basically just narrows the competitive balance of football further and further. And it's concerning for the game, although who knows what happens. There's going to be some discussions today about the potential future of the game.
Well, this sort of discussion perhaps wouldn't have even taken place at Web Summit when it sort of started off. The fact it's part of the conversation, we're even discussing rights issues in those countries, does shine that spotlight at least, and as media we sort of keep it up. But Joey, Miguel, great to have your insights, and thank you everyone for listening this morning in this morning panel. Thank you.